While Kerala's flourishing startup ecosystem offers a glimmer of hope, the broader Indian economy presents a more complicated picture. And particularly when we turn to the rather lofty ambitions expressed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Despite the bruising election results, Mr. Modi's vision for a Viksit Bharat or developed India by 2047 remains at the heart of his government's agenda. This goal, marking the centenary of India's independence, envisions our country moving beyond its emerging economy status to developed status. But recent economic indicators paint a rather worrying picture. The National Statistical Office has pegged India's GDP growth for 24-25 at the slowest pace in the last 4 years, at 6.4%, primarily due to sluggish performance in manufacturing and services, falling short of earlier expectations, including earlier projections by the Reserve Bank of India and by the Finance Ministry. Despite the fanfare around the government's 5 trillion economy promise, India's economic journey has been far from smooth. The road to a developed India, it seems, is not as straightforward or as smooth as it was painted. While the Modi government has indeed presided over economic growth, its record on job creation reveals a disquieting paradox: a growing economy that has struggled to produce sufficient opportunities for its labor force. Approximately 40% of India's workers remain tied to agriculture, a sector increasingly vulnerable to climate change, while just 20% are employed in manufacturing or business services such as IT. This imbalance underscores the conundrum of jobless growth, a critique the opposition has seized upon with vigor. Despite launching ambitious programs like Make in India and the Production-Linked Incentive Scheme, or PLI, which collectively aimed to revolutionize India's manufacturing landscape, tangible results have been elusive. Manufacturing's share of output has stubbornly stagnated since 2014, revealing the limitations of these initiatives in addressing structural bottlenecks. Meanwhile, agriculture, India's largest employer, faces existential threats from climate change, with projections suggesting the loss of 34 million jobs by 2030 due to rising temperatures and erratic monsoons. Even more troubling is India's glaring gender disparity in the labor force. As of 2023, only 32.7% of eligible women participate in the workforce, compared to 76.8% of men. We are an anomaly among nations with comparable income levels. Without deliberate intervention, India will fall short of its ambitious economic targets. To achieve the $30 trillion economy that Mr. Modi announced or envisioned for 2047, the nation will have to add 145 million women to its workforce, a Herculean task that requires dismantling entrenched societal norms and empowering women to lead economic change. And the urgency and importance of this challenge cannot be overstated. While India is, of course, ahead of China now as the world's most populous nation, projections suggest that our workforce will not outnumber theirs until the middle of the century, despite our population being significantly younger than China's. Over 50% of our population is below the age of 25, a demographic that could be our greatest strength or our greatest vulnerability. Yet this immense potential is at risk. Youth in particular are disproportionately affected, facing barriers to opportunities that threaten to undermine our demographic dividend. Without decisive action, this advantage could turn into a liability. You know that we have the world's highest unemployed number of college graduates. Now, to truly harness their potential, this young and vibrant nation that we're supposed to be, we have to move beyond political rhetoric and short-term fixes. Our future depends on bold reforms, streamlining regulatory processes, committing to much more open trade policies, and fostering inclusive growth that prioritizes opportunities for women and rural communities. If we fail to act now, the demographic advantage we celebrate today could become the challenge we regret tomorrow. Now let's turn our attention to manufacturing, a sector that holds a promise in some ways of transforming not only our economy, but the very lives of millions of unemployed Indians. It is a domain brimming with opportunities, capable of lifting countless individuals out of unemployment, driving innovation, and positioning India as a formidable force on the global stage. Because manufacturing, as we all know, is the engine of economic growth for many developed nations. It has the potential to create stable, long-term employment while fostering skill development and innovation. For India, with our vast workforce and abundant natural resources, this sector could become the backbone of our economic ambitions. We have the vision, or at least some of us do, and the capacity to become the world's manufacturing hub, especially as the global supply chains are increasingly looking for alternatives to China, or at least to a China plus one strategy. However, despite this immense potential, the growth of manufacturing in India has been stifled by systemic challenges that hold us back from just seizing this opportunity. One of the most significant obstacles, let's be honest, is our strict labor laws. These laws, though well-intentioned, are often rigid and outdated, creating barriers for businesses. Employers find themselves constrained by rules that limit flexibility, making it difficult for them to scale their operations or hire new workers. In trying to protect the rights of a few, we inadvertently create hurdles for the many, stifling the growth of industries that could otherwise absorb our unemployed into the labor force. Our aspirations to position India as a reliable China plus one alternative are further complicated by bureaucratic hurdles. The labyrinth of permissions, licenses, and approvals required to set up or expand manufacturing deters investors. These inefficiencies discourage multinational companies from committing themselves fully to India as much as they might, because in fact, they desire to diversify the supply chains, but we don't seem to them to be the best possible place to park their manufacturing. If we are to compete with other emerging economies, we're already trailing behind Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Mexico, and they're all vying for the same position, then we have to address our roadblocks decisively, or we will simply not get there. And then there is the question of infrastructure. We know that progress has been made. Let's not deny that. Reliable transportation networks, modern logistics systems, uninterrupted energy supply are all critical to a thriving manufacturing ecosystem. Yet there are still gaps in all these areas in our country. They increase costs and they make it harder for Indian manufacturers to compete on a global scale. Any country that aspires to be a manufacturing powerhouse must have reliable foundational infrastructure to support its ambitions. I agree progress is being made there, but is it enough? And have we reached a point where we can point to it as giving potential manufacturers the assurances they need? I'm not sure we are yet there, too. But that does continue to hinder the growth of many small and medium enterprises, which after all form the backbone of ours and any other country's manufacturing sector. Without adequate financial support, these enterprises struggle to scale up their operations, innovate, or play a meaningful role in global supply chains. These challenges are compounded by the need for streamlined regulations and a business-friendly environment to make India a preferred destination for foreign and domestic investments. With countries, as I said, like Vietnam and Indonesia, positioning themselves with greater success and much more aggressively. So we must overcome these roadblocks, and with the right policies and the right intent, we can make a tangible difference. Manufacturing is not just about factories and machines. It's about livelihoods, aspirations, the future of our nation. It is a sector that can bridge the gap between potential and prosperity, between ambition and achievement. If we're serious about realizing the promise of manufacturing and establishing ourselves as a manufacturing destination, we must tackle these challenges head-on, reform labor laws to balance flexibility with fairness, streamline bureaucratic processes to foster enterprise and investment, and invest in world-class infrastructure to ensure that no aspiring entrepreneur is left behind for lack of financial support. Our fiscal policy particularly India's commitment to maintaining a deficit target of 3% of GDP, reflects a prudent approach to fiscal discipline and long-term economic stability. However, despite these efforts, the reality has been less than ideal, with the fiscal deficit steadily growing over the past decade. This widening gap has placed significant strain on government finances, raising concerns about the sustainability of ongoing spending programs. While the government's aim to reduce the deficit to 4.5% of GDP by March 26 is a step in the right direction, it remains far from the original target. Such persistent fiscal imbalances are a matter of concern as they risk escalating borrowing costs and potentially jeopardizing India's credit rating. Moreover, the government's plan to shift its fiscal policy anchor from a fixed deficit target to a debt-to-GDP ratio after 26 is another indicator of strained finances. While this approach might offer flexibility, it doesn't address the root issue, our ever-growing reliance on borrowing to cover expenditures. High debt burdens not only constrain the government's capacity to invest in growth-oriented programs, but also make the economy vulnerable to external shocks. To add to this, India's current account deficit has widened significantly, driven by a persistent trade deficit and declining foreign investments. This imbalance further weakens our economic standing and complicates efforts to promote self-reliance while fostering growth. So while the government may tout high nominal growth rates as a buffer, the reality is that unchecked fiscal deficits, ballooning debt, and widening trade gaps pose significant risks to India's economic stability in the long run. These are issues we cannot afford to ignore if we are to ensure sustained and inclusive growth for the future. India, my friends, stands at a crossroads. The dreams of a Viksit Bharat by 2047 hinge not merely on growth figures, but on addressing the fissures in the labor market. The road to becoming a developed nation demands much more than ambition. It requires action, rooted in equity, sustainability, and structural transformation. Only then can we truly rise to India's promise as a global economic powerhouse. We must focus on addressing key challenges in human and capital development, particularly in education and healthcare, which hinder labor productivity and economic growth. With public expenditure on healthcare at only 1.9% of GDP, which is very low, our country lags behind in providing the necessary foundation for an efficient and adaptable workforce. Poor education and health outcomes limit labor productivity, a crucial factor in driving economic growth and improving living standards. As of 2019, India had the lowest GDP per hour worked among BRICS nations, largely due to the informal labor market, low technology adoption, and insufficient infrastructure. Addressing these issues requires not only increased public investment in education and in healthcare, but also a focus on skill development tailored to the needs of emerging industries, including those driven by climate change and digital transformation. By comparison, China's rapid productivity growth, driven by state-led industrial policies, infrastructure investments, export-led growth, and integration into global markets, has enabled them to significantly outperform India. Despite India being the fourth largest economy in the G20, by purchasing power parity, its GDP is only 17% of China's, reflecting the growth gap. If India had kept pace with China, at least with China's economic trajectory over the past 40 years, our GDP should have been around 10 trillion already, rather than the current 3.47 trillion. Our rural population makes up 64% of the total, and our low per capita income, infrastructure, while also formalizing the labor market, encouraging technological adoption, and improving governance models to facilitate large-scale projects. Additionally, policies that support gender equity in the workforce, as well as climate change resilience, will play key roles in fostering a more inclusive and sustainable economic growth trajectory. We in India ought to focus on bolstering our vital infrastructure. Instead of surging ahead of our competitors in Asia, we're lagging behind. continuing at a pace that is much too slow for rapidly transmuting India into an entrepreneurial and improve the quality of life right across the country, we must address these gaps. This means investing in rural and digital infrastructure that can enable more equitable growth and greater access to technology. Furthermore, a reform of labor laws, I've already mentioned this, combined with a favorable environment for incentives, can unlock significant potential in the manufacturing sector. One thing is clear. Despite the daunting challenges we face, Indians are still continuing to dream big, and those dreams have often translated into remarkable economic and technological progress.
Stay ahead with our cutting-edge news app. Instantly access the latest shorts in just 1 minute and breaking news in just 50 words. Download now for a smarter, faster news experience.